So the advantages of the IRR are pretty clear cut actually. The first is very simple. It's very intuitively appealing to know your rate of return. If you kind of think about how would you explain to a friend who is not necessarily in business or finance that a project is good. You could certainly go through the NPV and say this project has a positive NPV at a required rate of return of 8% and blah blah blah. But that's hard to understand if you're not familiar with the concept of net present value. However, you just said this is an investment that will offer you a rate of return of 20%. Most people understand what 20% means and whether that's good or not. As that part, it's also very simple to communicate how valuable a project is without getting into those estimation details. And finally, in certain cases, if you have an IRR that is high enough, that is a rate of return on an investment that's large enough, you may not even need to estimate a required return. If you were to come to me and say that you have an investment that will generate a return of 80%, I'm not going to quibble whether our required rate of return is 16% or 15%. 80% return on the investment is going to be good enough. I don't need to even know what the required rate of return truly is. When we compare the NPV and the IRR, as long as the project's cash flows are conventional and the project is independent, they will give you the same accept-reject signal. So conventional cash flows are those that have negative cash flows at the beginning, followed by positive cash flows in the future. And independent projects means that your decision to invest in one project is not dependent on another project. So you can think of this as you have a piece of land and you could build a mall, or you could build a grocery store. If you build the mall, that is a dependent project because it's dependent on not building the grocery store. So you want those independent projects to make sure that the IRR works. And that's really where the issues of the IRR arise. So the disadvantages of the IRR is that it does not distinguish between investing and borrowing. In some cases, the IRR will not even exist. Or with non-conventional cash flows, there might be more than one IRR. We have the issue with dependent projects, or what we call mutually exclusive investments, and this is due to scale and timing. And what we're going to do is go through each of these issues over the next few slides. So let's start with the first issue, which is lending versus borrowing. If you look here at this particular project, I have two projects, A and B. A is where you're lending, so you have a negative, you're lending money today, you'll receive money in the future. B is where you're borrowing, you receive money today, and then you pay in the future. The problem with the IRR is that it can't distinguish whether you're the lender or the borrower. So it knows, given these two cash flow series, negative 1,000 plus 1,500 or positive 1,000 minus 1,500, it knows that the return, the IRR, is 50%, but it doesn't know which side you're on. And if you were to do an NPV analysis, and I'm just going to use a generic 10%, the NPV analysis will tell you that A is positive, but B is negative. And so you don't want to be the borrower in this situation. And you can think of that in some sense intuitively. You'd rather lend at 50% than borrow at 50%, but the IRR can't distinguish. I also plot here for you the NPV of these investments given different rates of return. So the x-axis here is different rates of return. And you could see just how the NPV of A is declining over time, whereas the NPV of B is increasing over time. And they cross at 50%. We'll talk a little bit more about what that means in the future. Bottom line, if the recorded rate of return is above 50%, you'd rather be looking at project B. If it's below 50%, you'd rather be looking at project A. The second issue is where you could have multiple rates of return. Sometimes cash flows will have different discount rates to generate NPV equal to 0. We can actually see this with this series of cash flows where we have negative 60 today, 12 million for the next 9 years, and at time 10, negative 15. At 10%, the NPV will be 3.3 million. However, the IRRs for this particular project are minus 44% and plus 11.6%. I can show you that here on this graph, where you can see that there's where you can see how the NPV of plotting it over different discount rates will cross twice. Situations like this could certainly arise where you have projects that require some sort of negative cash flow at the end to sort of close up the project, end the project. Strip mining is sort of a textbook example where you know at the end of the project you're going to have to close up the mine, and that's going to cost you money. The way that the multiple rates of return, one way you can sort of know when this might be a problem is if you have the sign changes in the cash flows. And there's a mathematics rule called Descartes' rule of sign that actually tells you each time the sign changes, you have a potential IRR. So in the previous problem, we had 2 sign changes, and we did in fact have 2 IRRs. So whenever you see the sign change in your cash flows, if it happens more than once, negative, positive, and then goes positive, negative at some point, unconventional cash flows, you do have to be aware that the IRR might not work, and the NPV rule should be used. One small note here is on modified IRR, which is something the textbook does. I personally don't like this. I don't view this as necessary. I sort of skip the modified IRR. I think the strategy that you should employ is to identify the situations where the IRR might fail and utilize the NPV instead. One other thing about when we talk about the multiple rates of return and the different sign changes is what you might have, in fact, is no IRR. And in this project C, in this series of cash flows, you can try calculating the IRR, but it won't work. The NPV at 10% is 42. If I plot the IRR here, and I plot the IRR on against the different discount rates, what you see is that this is 0 here, so I never have an NPV that goes below 0. This is great. This means this project is a very solid positive net present value project. So sometimes because no IRR exists doesn't mean it's a bad thing. In this case, it's actually it's a great thing. We'll continue with this section in the next video.